Okay, again, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. So for folks who don't know me, my name is Jessie Anderson. I'm a Senior Conflict Advisor in USAID Center for Resilience. And before we get going, I'm just gonna go over a few housekeeping points, and we can head to the next slide. So this event will be conducted in both English and French. So please make sure to choose your preferred language, either English or French, by clicking that globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So once you click on the interpretation globe, you'll be able to select your language. And after that, you might want to mute the original audio or follow along at a lower volume. And if you're having any issues with that, please reach out in the chat box to anyone with real in their names for support. And I know because I'm speaking in English, we're putting a link in the chat box to access the French version. Perfect. And we can head to the next slide. So I will also just give a high-level overview of our agenda today. The reason we are here together is to discuss key takeaways from the Rapid Learning Series brief on what we can learn from livelihoods programming in Northeast Nigeria when it comes to social sources of resilience. I'm really excited about this research. And to do that, we will kick off with a presentation from Mercy Corps' Jamila Mahdi and Vi Krishnan. After that, we will be heading into a moderated panel with our presenters, as well as additional Mercy Corps colleagues and USAID colleagues with us. And then finally, we will open up to Q&A with all of you. So with that, and to kick us off, I will now welcome Mercy Corps researcher Vi Krishnan and Enterprise Investment Fund Manager Jamila Mahdi to kick us off. I know they're getting us started with a poll before the presentation, so thank you very much for leading that for us. And Vi and Jamila, over to you.
Thanks, Jessie. Good morning, everyone. My colleague Corinne is going to pull up 2 poll questions. So if you don't mind just taking just a minute to respond to their questions. They're quite quick. I'm looking at these responses coming in, and it's interesting. All right. So it looks like we have about 50 participants. Got half responses so far. We'll give it a few more seconds. Okay. I think we're good. So Karina, if you want to just pull up the poll responses on the screen, is that, or okay, this is where it is, right? Okay. All right, good. Let's take a look at this. So if you looked at that first question, which was, I believe that children get hyped up by sugar, and you thought you were on the wrong webinar, I just wanted to say you're not. You're very much on the right webinar. And I'm just looking at the responses. 88% said yes. And if you said yes, you are in the majority. But I did want to say that actually you're wrong, because research actually finds that, you know, this children getting hyped up by sugar is apparently an urban legend, and it's actually not true. So this begs the question, you know, why does research not translate into practice? Why does research not help us change our beliefs? And apparently one of the reasons for this is because researchers tend to stay on the findings and not really help unpack the practices behind the finding. Why did something happen? And so we're hoping to change that a little bit today. And that was the reason we wanted to ask you this question, to see where you go. The second question, let's look at how you did. Livelihood interventions, economic capacities, 58%, 42%, great, okay. Again, this, I apologize, this was a trick question. You should have had a third response which said both. But intuitively, when we think about livelihood interventions, we do think about the economic sources of resilience or capacities that it helps, you know, improve for people. So we just wanted to see how many of us are actually thinking about these social capacities like agency or aspirations for the future, because a lot of research is now beginning to highlight how important these are not only for people to bounce back from shocks, but also to escape poverty and stay out of there. And this is going to be what we're going to be talking about from the Northeast Nigeria case study. So with that, I want to say thank you for responding to the poll, and let's move into the presentation. Great. Okay. So what I want to do, like I said before, is I want to focus more on what Jamila and I learned from the Northeast Nigeria context. So in this webinar, we want to stay focused a bit more on what did we find, which is the number 6, and want to really try to unpack why did we find what we found, how did that come about? And we want to take that to the next step to say, what are the promising practices that we think are attributed to these findings, and how can we co-create these into program interventions in protracted crises context. But just to give you an overview of how did we actually get there, it started with this question where USAID said, well, what are the pathways? What are the mechanisms through which resilience interventions improve people's well-being? And this itself is borne out of an evidence review that a colleague of mine, Jeon Kim, did along with a shared trust, and you'll meet Jeon on the panel. So this question was born out of there, and we said, well, let's try to find out how does this pan out in a protracted crisis context, because that's where we feel like we're hamstrung. We seem to not be able to move beyond a more sort of a handout approach. So we landed on Northeast Nigeria because Jamila's team and another team were doing some really interesting market systems approach work here. So we said, let's talk about this in this context. So in my initial conversations with Jamila, I was trying to understand more about the livelihood intervention of her program. So she starts talking about how women are feeling more empowered by the program. And so this obviously, takes me a little bit by surprise. I was curious. So I did go out to Northeast Nigeria to meet with about 24 women participants across 2 programs, both very similar. And we asked this question not only about people's program experience, but we said, tell us a bit more about what are the benefits you feel from this program, not just the economic benefits, but we wanted to drill down into the non-economic benefits. And I'm going to talk you through what we found, but I think what is important is for Jamila to explain a bit more about the Northeast Nigeria context, if you're not familiar, and tell us a little bit more about the program. So Jamila, can I hand it over to you for that, please?
Okay, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be here. Thank you, Vi, and thank you for coming to Northeast Nigeria. So when we talk about Northeast Nigeria, we're talking about Borno State specifically. So Borno State is situated in northeastern part of Nigeria. If you all remember, turning the point over a decade now, we have issues that has to do with the Boko Haram insurgency, where we have human lives that are being lost. We have displacement, we have loss of trust-based networks, destructions of market and roads. And I would just want to highlight that in the sense that we had this issue in Borno State. However, the experience of the impact of the insurgency is different within different locations. And this is why the team started with a more urban location where it's somewhat stable. And then we moved from there, take the learning and moved to more rural areas. So while we moved to more rural areas, there were challenges which has to do with road access, but we find a way of addressing it while we were on the program. So now to dive into the program itself. Poultry Development for Resettlement is the name of the program, which we call it PDR, abbreviated. I will want to appreciate Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for funding the PDR pilot program. While we work in a conflict-affected area, poultry development for resettlement is a little bit shift away from the traditional handout humanitarian approach that we normally have in crisis context. However, what we did was to explore a feasibility of market in a fragile context. So the program, we deliberately choose two interventions, which is one of it is poultry livelihood, and as well the economic side, which has to do with the Village Savings and Loan Association. So we might be asking, why are we doing that? So one of the things is why we chose these two interventions is to see from our program assessment that was conducted, we found out that poultry is more associated with women because for women, it is not time consuming. It won't affect their time poverty. It is also suitable for women. It is also as well culturally acceptable as it does not require women to go out or to take far lengthy work to go to their businesses. And it can also be easily done at home, which is also associated with the breed that was chosen. And as well, the breed that was chosen was so adaptive to harsh weather and it feeds on kitchen waste. So on the VSLA part, there was a constraint for women in terms of lending options. Women were not able to lend money. They were not able to borrow money from even their immediate family, which has to take them out of their immediate family to market actors. And as well, going to the market actors, they do not have that autonomy of lending money because there was nothing doing. So this is like the what and the how or the why of this program. And then diving into how we did the program, Mexico partnered with Amo Farm, which is the sole producer of Noila in Nigeria, where Mexico and Amo Farm identified brooding units. So these brooding units, we name them mother units. While we have the mother unit to brood chicks from day old to 5 weeks, Amo Farm supply this mother unit for the chicken. So another thing we do was to, okay, while these chickens are 5 weeks, the program linked the women to the mother unit and as well introduces the promotional model where we call it buy one and get one for free. So which makes every woman invest with their money. So it is at a minimal price. However, when you buy one chicken, you get one chicken for free. How amazing. So at the back end, Mexico is the one subsidizing the chicken for women. So if you remember, I mentioned that the program identified a constraint in terms of financial status, in terms of access to lending. So what we did on PDR was to look at mobilizing those women and as well establishing village savings and loan associations for the women, for them to have a better access to informal lending, for them to have access to other social capital like capacity building, like other information that is going to be between women and skill sets. So in a nutshell, this is what we did on PDR. I'll hand over to Vi to talk about the experience she got during the research. Over to you, Vi.
Thanks. So I think a lot of what Jamila said, I think in terms of the program approach and the choice of this particular livelihood, I think all had a really important bearing on the findings. So I want to delve a little bit into that. Let's talk about this because we were hearing a majority of the narratives we heard from women across both the programs that we were talking, not just PDR, was an increase in self-esteem. You know, they were more confident, there was more agency. But what does that, what about the program is actually driving these findings? So it was interesting that the buy one, get one free promotion that Jamila talked about. Now, this is not something that you'd normally see in a humanitarian context. We don't really try this kind of option. But what it did was it actually changed the mindset of women from being these vulnerable, beneficiaries or receiving a handout to actually becoming part of the poultry livelihood chain. So it made them feel like, well, this is my business, I own it, because they were actually investing their own money. And this helped them to actually continue that economic engagement. And we kept hearing women saying, you know, I feel a lot of dignity, my self-esteem is improved because I have a job to do. Now, what they basically were alluding to there was the economic value of, or the economic contribution that they were able to make to the households with the poultry livelihood actually helped them feel like they were really a partner in the household, you know, problems or expenses. So this really gave them a sense of dignity. It's not that they were not doing stuff before. They were doing petty trade, for example. They were selling caps, you know, the traditional headgear that men wear. But I think this was a shift in the economic contribution that they were making that made them feel a lot better about themselves. And the VSLAs played an equally important role because it served multiple functions. So these women from the poultry livelihood were mobilized into these VSLA groups, but it became a platform not just for them to access savings and capital for their livelihood needs, but it was also where they could access sort of technical information about the poultry livelihood. They could share their experiences about the, you know, how their own business was developing, and essentially they were just motivating one another to continue with their business or to expand into other businesses. I'm going to move into the next finding because this was also very interesting around, you know, social networks, strengthen and diversified social networks. Now, this was a complex one to unpack, but I want to say in a nutshell, this showed us how the economic connections and the social connections sort of interlink. They're not really two separate, but there's a huge linkage between these two. And this is not the first time we're seeing this. If you talk to Jion later on the panel, she will tell you that in South Sudan, we did a research where we had something very similar. But let me tell you how this worked in the Northeast Nigeria context. A lot of the women on this program, you know, some of them didn't know one another before they got in, but the fact that they were all involved in this poultry business, or, you know, that they were working on this together, was the first point of contact. So it helped them to get to know other women. So it was their starting point of the relationship. But these relationships were strengthened during the VSLA meetings, because the VSLA meetings were not just about saving and lending, but it was also women sharing their experiences. But what started out as talking about their businesses soon also turned into, you know, I have a domestic problem, what do I do? You know, my husband is doing X or, you know, Y, or so on and so forth. So this sort of exchange solidified the trust and solidarity among women. Women really started to feel like there's someone here for me, you know, we're there for one another. And it promoted well-being. And I think this is particularly important when it's a context where there's been a lot of displacement or displacement-related trauma. For women to feel that someone is looking out for me, it really helped promote their well-being. But I think what's interesting here is that this sort of trust and solidarity meant that women were really invested in the well-being, in each other's well-being. They wanted to make sure that everyone succeeded. So they started teaching each other different types of livelihood skills. You know, they would come to the VSLA meetings with, you know, different experiences to share. Some women also started putting, you know, these other women, VSLA members, in touch with their own friends or family in other states to start some kind of new business. So it was really just how they were expanding these their economic connections and diversifying into yeah, well, I'll stop there. So these were some of the things we heard on the research itself. Now, I want to make sure, Jamila, when you were talking to program participants and your experience of the field implementation, how much of this, what I've just talked about, feels true for you?
Oh, wow. So for program participants, while we meet with them on a daily basis, we do monitoring. And from our interactions with these women feel the respect now being handed over to them. They feel they have that respect from within their households, which includes their husbands and as well immediate family. And again, when we were talking to them, they were so excited in terms of their voices is being heard and they're being seen within their locations, within their different communities. And as well, most especially, they socialize and network with other people currently, not as it were before when they were just at home sitting down without doing nothing. Most importantly, they feel that participation on household decision making, where they can decide to do anything with their money, and as well also improve in their household needs. Actually, one of our women mentioned she was able to pay school fees, she was able to diversify her business, and as well she have respect from her husband, and her husband takes decision alongside her, which also takes me to one of the striking one of the things that makes me happy when you were conducting the research, which is men's perception about women has evolved. So women talked about meaningful economic contribution. This is when women are now feeling they contribute to the affairs of the household and the community at large. You have women talking about financial freedom from VSLA. They feel they can now access quick cash through their savings groups and as well take care of their needs, which has to do with business expansion, has to do with diversification of businesses, and also school and hospitals, which is one of the things that is so paramount to them. Another thing is when women became more self-reliant, and also it increases and have that communication being improved between them and also their husbands, and as well for the community at large. I wouldn't know, maybe I will throw it back to you if you have other field experiences to talk about. Over.
I don't have any field experiences. I can tell you what I heard in the research. I wish I could be based in Northeast Nigeria, but maybe if you'll give me a job, Jamila. I did want to say that I think what Jamila was talking about, this, men's perceptions about women's role, was something we heard not just from participants in the PDR program, where women felt that, their husband or the male members in the community had, their perceptions of women were different. But on the other program, which we haven't delved into in this particular webinar, there were mixed gender groups where men and women were working alongside one another. And in that, what appeared, this particular quote actually comes from that. And there, what it appeared to contribute to these changed perceptions was men and women working together as equals, as partners. Men began to see women in a different light because they began to see their capabilities, and so they just began to see them in a different light. But I think what was also interesting on that one was that while men began to see their women program participants in a different light, this also seemed to translate into their own attitudes towards how they perceive their own wives when they went back home, their own wives' capacities. And I think it was really interesting for us to see men describe what the participation with women was, how it was changing their attitudes. But all that being said, I mean, we've talked a lot about the positives. It's not that this program was easy to implement or this approach was easy to implement. I do want to talk about just ground what we've just found in a couple of the challenges. So one of the challenges was around, we talked a lot about this buy one, get one free approach. I mean, it was important to women's sense of ownership, but we also said earlier that women have constraints in terms of borrowing. They're able to borrow from their family, but not from external market actors. So some women were not able to participate, particularly those who were unable to borrow, whether it was in their own family or women who had been newly displaced, who didn't know anyone or who'd been separated. So it did mean that for some women, there were barriers to participate, although we did think that this approach was quite valuable. Jamila, do you want to talk us through the market-based approach?
Sure. So With the market-based approach, and if you remember, we talked about being in the rural and as well the urban area. So for us, it was a bit challenging when it comes to more explanation to the households, to the community on how to do the smart subsidy, or on how to, for them, they should invest their money in terms of what the program is like, or how to ensure and encourage sustainability for them and ownership, which is very, very important. So this was a bit challenging, particularly within the rural area where it's not really stable. And if you remember, I talked about road access, which is one of the things that was a bit hinge for us during the program, but we were able to overcome it. So over to you, Bai. This is all about the market-based approach.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, and I won't spend too much of time on limitations because this was just before COVID. So I would have liked to see, you know, how these different, the social capacities that we were saying for these women, how did that make a difference to their well-being, you know, during COVID? But we didn't get an opportunity to see that. But I think that's something that we would like to continue to investigate. But I do want to just reflect here a little bit that I think as Jamila and I were going through these findings, there are a lot of promising practices, particularly around the program design, the specific selection of specific selection of assets, etc., that seem to jump to the forefront for us. And I hope we can talk about that more in detail, either during the panel discussion or during the Q&A with all of you. With that, I'll say thank you again for bearing with us, and I'll hand you back over to Jessie.
Jamila and Vi, thank you so much for that. I really liked how it tied into past briefs that we've been, sharing in this series in terms of thinking about social sources of resilience. I think this theme is that we know these things matter, but we don't always know how to program to them, what that looks like, what the evidence is. And so thank you for building on that and kind of weaving that thread in with your work. I really enjoyed that. And then, my hunch too is that a lot of folks on the line have been engaged in livelihoods programming. And so this is something that I think, and I hope, and we'll get to this in the Q&A, it's just going to resonate because we often have a lot of livelihoods programming and maybe aren't necessarily mapping out what are all of those other impacts beyond, those direct economic impacts. So yeah, thank you for sharing. I'm super excited to dig into this with our panel. And so with that, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Jian Kim, Senior Researcher with Mercy Corps, as well as Jasmine Ohaniere, Agricultural Officer and Resilience Coordinator with USAID Nigeria's Office of Economic Growth and Environment. They will be joining Jamila and Vi on the stage, so to speak, for this moderated panel. And I also wanted to flag for folks, we will head into open Q&A after this, so please feel free to start putting your questions in the chat box. And with that, I will start asking some questions. So my first question is for Jian. And I really liked how we dove into Northeast Nigeria, really thinking about a specific place and context. I would love it because I know that you've done such great work on this, Jian. If you could maybe help us situate this in that global evidence landscape. How did the insights that Vi and Jamila shared from the PDR work, how does that tie in with what you're seeing in the global evidence? And, what are some of your thoughts on how this fits in?
Thanks very much, Jessie and Vi and Jamila for their great presentation. I'll speak very briefly about the evidence review that Vi alluded to earlier. And I think not to play a trick on you guys, but I think in design, I think many of the findings that Vi and Jamila spoke to emerged in the evidence review as it, helped to inform some of the design of the study. But, nevertheless, I think it's really important to, highlight some ways in which what they found in Northeast Nigeria tracks with the global evidence base. So before I dive in and, talk about what we found as part of the global evidence review, let me just zoom out for a quick second for those who may not be familiar with the evidence review and also why we may have been interested in digging into psychosocial factors and the linkages to resilience through the lens of women's groups. I think increasingly, as Vi and Jamila mentioned, there's been a broader appreciation and understanding that psychosocial factors matter in terms of the way in which it is contributing to resilience. In 2018, a USAID evidence review, highlighted there are several factors that really transcend context. So regardless of where you are focusing, there are factors that matter and are really important determinants of resilience. And psychosocial factors, and in particular, social capital, aspiration, self-efficacy, the confidence to adapt, women's empowerment and supportive social norms, all of which that Vi and Jamila just spoke to now, really emerged as important factors in that global evidence review. And, that naturally begs the question. So what are then ways in which programs and policies that can then invest, knowing that these things matter in contexts where we work to facilitate these psychosocial factors? And anecdotally, I think often, as Vi and Jamila mentioned, women's groups came to the forefront as potential candidate for this. And then that is what that prompted the evidence review. So recognizing the importance of psychosocial factors, recognizing the potential role women's groups can play in that space. What do we know so far about the linkages between psychosocial factors and what role women's groups can play in facilitating that to ultimately build resilience for the members and those broader household members? So to that end, ultimately the purpose of this evidence review was highlight what we know so far and, relatedly, what we don't know. And then secondly, to showcase ways in which programs can think more concretely about why these things matter and potential opportunities for programs to think about more intentionally ways in which they can invest in the psychosocial dimensions of women's groups to facilitate resilience, concurrent to their investments in the economic space.
Femmes pour
one thing that I want to preface is
alors une chose que je veux dire au début, c'est que l'évidence basée
outcomes are widely developed. It's very deep. But that being said, the evidence based on women's groups and the impact on psychosocial factors are quite nascent and thin. So just want to make sure that we are, whatever I'm about to say next is drawn from that evidence base where we have much more work to do, but it is quite limited and focused largely in Southeast Asia, where a lot of the women's groups have many of their roots. And so in many ways, Jamila and Vi's work is a really nice contextual and geographic variation on the evidence base. It's focusing on a very limited geographic context. So I'll just highlight a couple of points and I'll throw it back to you, Jessie. I think the first is that what's coming out really strongly, as Jamila and Vi found out, is that women's groups can have substantial consequences for a range of women's psychosocial factors. The review, as their study, focused on social capital and women's economic and political empowerment. And there are very few studies that tease apart women's groups, unique contribution to specific psychosocial factors. So it's difficult to talk about how, for example, women's groups may be informing women's aspiration relative to their contribution to social capital, for example. But nevertheless, despite the limitations, we're seeing really clear signals that women's groups can be an incredibly important contributor to psychosocial factors. What's really important here, and I think will be interesting to unpack further, is that women's groups may be contributing to social capital, for example, and then that those impacts on social capital may be occurring even when there are negligible impacts on economic outcomes of interest. So, thinking about women's groups and the potential contributions they may be making, how do we think about and tease apart and account for potential synergistic interactions between psychosocial and economic indicators that remains largely to be seen. And I think Vi and Jamila's study kind of help us scratch the surface there, and I think it'll be really exciting to dig more. The second point that I'll just make is that digging into the program dimensions and activities that help to actually facilitate some of these psychosocial outcomes remain largely to be seen. And I think that's what was in particular exciting about Vi and Jamila's work, is that it helps to kind of tease apart what activities, what ways of coming together as a group is helping to facilitate these impacts. I think there's a lot that's a lot to be unpacked in terms of the pathways by which programs can invest. The group composition is another one. The ways in which the timing of these groups, the ways in which they are layered in terms of different types of activities in these groups, and the way all of these things are then collectively contributing to women's psychosocial factors, and overall their resilience remain largely to be seen. And tracking with what they were saying globally, we found 3 potential ways. So access to savings, loans, and financial institutions seem really critical. Technical support and advice, such as training that they spoke to already, and then just the sense of group solidarity and having a built-in network seem to really matter. I'll just pause there and then just say that, additional research is really required, especially, to pieces that is talked about, the mechanisms, the unique contributions, the interactions between economic and psychosocial factors that may be facilitated through these groups. And then also, how do these things manifest in protracted and conflict context, compared to more relative context within which many of these studies are have been conducted, remain to be seen. But I would say largely what they shared seemed really aligned, and then they're contributing by providing geographic variation and also talking about the how. Thanks.
Gianna, I found that so helpful. And I guess I'm hearing a takeaway is that there's so much more research we need to do. There's so much more that needs to be investigated, especially with that earlier focus, much more on the economic impacts. But I'm going to push researchers outside of their comfort zone a little bit with my next question to Vi, which loops onto that idea of what are those programming dimensions? What are those key takeaways? Because I know we probably have a lot of folks who are thinking, super eager for the research to develop. That's so interesting, but what might I do differently tomorrow? In my programming, what should I be thinking about? And so for Vi, I'm curious, for folks who might be about to design a new program, who are in that headspace, what's some low-hanging fruit you might suggest coming out of the research for what folks can be thinking about doing a little differently based on your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was a program manager in my previous life, right? So I think I can tell you now that I think one of my biggest surprises on this was that I didn't go in looking for these social resilience capacities, and that was a bit of a surprise, although I know, John's evidence review points that it shouldn't be. But taking from that, I think if you're a program manager, if you're a practitioner designing, or actually if you're already implementing a livelihood intervention in a protracted crisis context, don't just go in looking for the economic capacities or the money or the assets or the resources, but try to dig a bit deeper to understand what else is happening. So I think the easiest way to do that is to ask the question, beyond the economic benefits, what are the other benefits you're perceiving, and then kind of go from there, because I think that's the part that we took. I kind of stumbled on it, but I do think that's an important one to say that actually your livelihood intervention may be doing a lot more than you think it is. So, take the time to find out if these social capacities are developing, and then try to think about how is that, what about your program is contributing to that. So coming to the what about your program is contributing to. So if you're designing a new program, for example, I think what I learned from PDR is what Jamila was describing, the why did we choose specific interventions. So they chose the Noilers, they chose the chickens because it was suitable for women, it had a market demand, it was something that, women could do easily from home, and they chose the VSLAs for specific reasons. So I do think the it's not just about providing any inputs. I think if you're thinking about how do I increase the impact for, I mean, I want to target women on my program, don't just, you know, say, okay, I'm going to 50% of my target is going to be women, because I think men are equally in need in conflict contexts. So I think we want to be sensitive, not to shift the balance there, right? So if you want to intentionally work with women, I think one of the easier ways, as PDR seems to point the way, is to think about, you know, what are gender-specific livelihoods and how can I involve men and women in these separate livelihoods? And the last one I will say is, I did allude to promising practices when I started this discussion. I do want to say, and the things that stood out to me were the fact that the livelihood input they chose was suitable for their target audience. It had an economic, you know, it was economically viable. It had a profitability factor to it, and the integration of that alongside the VSLAs. And if you've done VSLAs before, I don't have to sell that concept to you. You know that it's a magical concept, right? But I do think on this program, the bringing together of the livelihood and the VSLAs was actually a really, really good synergy to bring about these sort of social capacities. I'll stop there, and yeah, I'll back to you, Jessie.
Thanks, Vi. And I wanted to loop on to something you were referencing right there, which is to just bring this back to the Northeast Nigeria context and more generally what it means to be doing these kinds of things in fragile and conflict affected contexts in general. So our next couple of questions, we'll kind of dig into the reality of what are some of those challenges, even if you want to be doing this work, what might be getting in the way, and what does that look like? And so I'm going to turn to Jamila next. And I know we alluded to this, Jamila. So Vi said that you were able to expand this program to more hard to reach areas. I'm curious if you could just tell us more about that, you know, how you managed to do that, challenges you faced, and just a little bit more about what that looks like. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, we have gone to a more hard to reach area. But going to a more hard to reach area, like I mentioned before, road was a little bit of challenging because of the road closure, sometimes by military, sometimes insurgency and around that. So what we did was to mobilize market actors. While we mobilize market actors, ensuring that the transport union workers are taking the lead on that, we mobilize transport union workers, we mobilize poultry farmers, we mobilize poultry service providers, and all the key players in the poultry aspect, and as well other key stakeholders within the field or within the community to come and establish like a multi-stakeholder platform, like a platform where they have access to information, they have access to other kind of benefits within them, where as a transport worker or as a poultry farmer or as a mother unit, your goods are coming in from another part of the country, still where the whole brooding processing is happening, but you are at ease because you have access to those information, because you have access to the road, because you get to build that relationship, that coordination between the stakeholders, between the vigilante, and as well have your businesses going on, which will encourage more sustainability and encourage more ownership within the community without humanitarian aid coming into that. So that is what we did to mitigate a little bit on the road closure, our road access hit we got within the field. And over to you.
Jamila, thank you so much for that. And now I'm excited to get Jasmine in on this conversation with a USAID perspective. So I actually have a two-part question, so I'll try to divide this up. But I wanted to continue this idea of, you know, what are the challenges working in this space, this time from a donor perspective. Jasmine, I'm curious, you know, what are some of the challenges you are facing working in Northeast Nigeria. And then in particular, if you have thoughts on this, I'm curious what you see as barriers for investing in this area of trying to think more intentionally about psychosocial factors, social sources of resilience in programming. And then I have a follow-up question after that. But yeah, over to you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jessie. And this panel and this conversation as a whole has been very enlightening and informative, and also very similar to quite a few of the activities that we're doing here in USA, Nigeria, which makes sense. We do similar activities in looking for the best ways to deal with the major challenges that are happening currently in Northeast Nigeria, and for us, Nigeria as a whole. But when it comes into the factors of like major challenges that we have here in Northeast Nigeria, I would say it's three really major factors, but they're many. But I would say the insecurity, which affects the market accessibility, which I like what Jamila was talking to, of finding ways to make, mobilizing the stakeholders in the business or in the food chain, the value chain that they're working on. I would say insufficient infrastructure, which aligns with which affects the market. And then some of the major problems would be language barriers and cultural barriers, which can come into play because there are such a large amount of displaced people. So when I think about the insecurities which affect the market, I would say it affects the farmers immensely when it comes into the play of them being able to produce a product that is high value. So when you're thinking of the idea of bringing these, buy one chicken, get one free, I'm sure this is a higher quality breed of chicken that you guys are using because you want it to be something that could be sustainable and can bring income to the women that you're working with. Thus, it's important to be able to get those high value chickens into the community. However, it comes into being a problem because you have people don't have always the ability. It's not always these activities where people are able to bring in higher value, in this case, livestock or seeds or things of that sort, so that they can have a better product. So then you have these low agricultural productivity, which affects their livelihoods and affects the community and brings even higher levels of unemployment, notably when it comes to women and youth. We already spoke about mobility. I love that idea that they're working on at the mobilizing people to be able to get things, but mobility is a problem because of the insufficient infrastructure. It's hard to get things to different people, and even deeper, field availability is not always there. People aren't able to even get, if they were going to transport it with trucks or transport it with even small cars, the availability of fuel is highly important. And when it comes to that, because the inability of fuel is there, people don't have, they cannot afford the transportation of goods. They can't afford the transportation of the products that they need in order to produce and get create a better livelihood for themselves. And thus, it is a repetitive cycle of them being affected by the insecurity and inability for the government to get the right things, the resources to the people so that they can have effective livelihoods. In terms of the infrastructures, the roads are in horrible conditions. It's hard for people to reach certain places. They're having to find different modes of transportation to get to places, which could be going through mountains, taking boats, things of that sort, because there is a lack of availability of sufficient or effective transportation. And then when it comes to something that's very important in making sure that you're having being effective in the work that you're doing, or being effective in selling a product, or even building relationships, you would need communication. And a lot of problems that people have is mobile problems. There's a lot of outings with mobile phones or telecommunications. And because phone towers are being attacked, it's many different reasons as to why communication becomes something that is a factor that really affects being able to create a better livelihood for people. Excuse me. And then lastly, just coming into the language barriers and cultural barriers. People speak different languages. There's many languages spoken in Nigeria. When it comes into a donor coming into play, having one of our implement partners work with a community, it's not 100% chance that that partner that we're working with will be able to speak the language that's spoken there. So in some cases, we have third parties that help us communicate, and sometimes things can get lost in translation. So building that trust in the communities that we need in order to be effective in the work that we need to do is not always there. And then the cultural norms. People have, in a lot of cases, in a lot of work that we do, in order to be most effective, we have to build the trust of the communities. And if they don't even trust us because they can't communicate with us, they think we're doing something opposite of what they need, they don't know what we're doing, they've been told that people, outsiders will bring only bad things. You just never know what the scenario could be. And that becomes a negative factor for us to effectively do our work. But overall, major barriers that definitely affect the psychological factors that come into play for USAID are just the residual effects of being in chaos. Being surrounded by terrorists, not knowing exactly what's going to happen the next day, not knowing if you're going to be safe or if you have to move so that your safety is taken into consideration. That psychologically, of course, for generations will affect you. Back again, the cultural norms and belief systems, those are things that can be some barriers for us. And then in the North is a very conservative culture. So the conservative culture in some plays, it can be a barrier because we have to be very thoughtful when we think of the things that we're doing and the work that we're doing with the community. So that's what I have. Thank you.
Jasmine, thank you so much for laying that out. I mean, it's sobering, but I think super helpful for just thinking about what those barriers are, what those things are that get in the way. I had a quick follow-up question for you about internal USAID processes too. You know, I'm wondering, I'm curious what you think would help or would be necessary to support investing in this space, you know? So I'm curious, you know, looping on to Jian's comments about, you know, where the research is, how it's kind of nascent. I'm curious if certain like proof of concept studies, pilots, or evidence would help encourage work on, you know, integrating more psychosocial factors, focusing on social sources of resilience, or if there's any other factors beyond that, perhaps that might help move the needle and encourage investment in this space. So yeah, over to you if you have any thoughts on that.
Absolutely. And I completely agreed with Jan when she said that research is essential in order for us to be effective in the work that we're doing. I think the research is extremely important. And then as we're implementing at USA, we have a continuous learning activity, CLA. And with that, it's like you learn as you go. So you might do your research and have effective research and knowing, okay, this might work in this community. And then you try it out. You work with the community, implement it. And as you're going through it and as you're doing it, you determine, oh, what changes do we need to do to make this more effective? And I think that's a great approach, especially in this context, because you might do research and think that, oh, if we go ahead and do it this way, this will work perfectly. But then all these other factors might come into play that you might have considered, but you really don't know how they will play out. So in that terms, it's good to make adaptations as you go, and then be very involved in the implementation and very involved in the community, building those relationships as you go, because the stronger the build of the community and the involvement in the community that we have, the more effective in the program that we have, and the more opportunity is for it to be more sustainable. One thing which was also alluded to was doing trainings and trainings for different reasons. But I would say trainings for like conflict sensitive or gender sensitive areas are essential, not only for us, but also for the communities in a way that can help them work through some of the hardships, the factors, the things that are pushing against them in order for them to be effective, so that it could be a way for them to see a light at the end of the tunnel. So those are things I suggest.
Jasmine, thank you so much for that. And I am going to give out 2 more questions to our panelists, and then I'm going to open it up to you all because I'm actually seeing a ton of great questions in the chat. So for those questions, and I think folks will be super interested in this, Jamila, I wanted to turn to you and just see if you could share some details on PDR, kind of tell folks how the story ends. I'm curious, what has happened since this case study was written, and what's kind of the next iteration of programming you envision? How do you plan to expand, or what do you kind of see coming next in this space, and especially based on the experiences that you just shared? So thanks for that, and over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So when we talk about expanding, for this, I might not have the answer to that. Probably I might get back to you on that. However, right from there, PDR has been a learning environment. What we did in Mercy Corps was to take learnings from PDR and as well put them in some of the programs. Currently, I am on the rural resilience activity, so learnings of the savings groups, learning of how we evolve things from PDR is also translating down to the rural resilience activity, and as well trying to connect the participants, trying to as well also connect how we're going to see resilience has come into play, which is some of the things that I love when she was talking about collaboration, learning, and adaptation, which is why one of the collaboration, learning, and adaptation advisor is currently doing in terms of understanding what has happened with PDR program, and as well learn it into other rural resilience activity program. And beyond rural resilience activity program, which we put the learnings in, what we are doing is trying to look at, in a fragile context, what are those things that we can do easily? What are those things people are willing to go into businesses to bounce back? What do we do, or what are we going to do to see that we bring them out of the shock, in the sense that whenever there's shock, they will be able to bounce back. So in other proposals, in other learning beats, and as well want to have Vi to come back to Nigeria and also look at how does this impact during COVID and after COVID, how does it impact on the assessment that we have done before, and then to compare it with what is happening currently now. So I think this is just what I can say about the expansion, and as well what we did after the program. Over.
Awesome, Jamila, thank you so much for that. And I wanted to turn to Vi for a final quick question, which is basically, I wanted to just give you a little space to share anything that was a surprising finding, an interesting nugget that didn't get to make its way into the PowerPoint presentation. Yeah, basically, is there anything that you'd like to share as we turn the corner towards the open Q&A? Thanks.
I think my surprising finding is that Jamila wants me to come back to Nigeria. But jokes apart, no, I think I just want to say that we didn't go in looking for these social resilience capacities. And it was really exciting to be able to find it. And of course, John did a fantastic job of breaking my discovery bubble by telling me that it's actually it is something that's common, that you find in other contexts as well. But I do want to say that, yes, that was absolutely amazing. I won't take too much time. I did want to just one quick reaction to what Jasmine was saying about, Jasmine, you said, there's the people had this sort of residual impact of the conflict because they don't know what's going to happen, and that's affecting their psychology. And I do think that's an important point because this happens across all conflict contexts. But we also find that for people who are able to have an economic opportunity, have some sort of livelihood, their psychosocial well-being is better than those who don't. And that's a really interesting one for us. We found that in Syria, and I think there was also another study by Alexander Chen in the Syrian refugee context, where she found that actually more than the impact of the conflict itself, what affected children's executive function or cognitive function was actually poverty. So I just want to highlight to my colleagues out there that as we're working on conflict context or protracted crisis context, I know it's hard to do livelihood interventions, but I think it's just so important to be able to find ways to do that. So I'm going to stop there, and yes, I'll happy to answer any other questions.
Vi, thank you for that. And I'm just reflecting, but then I want to get to all the great questions that we have. I think there was a nice mix here of acknowledging the challenges to working in contexts like Northeast Nigeria, that we're not trying to sugarcoat anything. This isn't necessarily easy, but a recognition that it's also important. And I also think, Jamila and Vi, you did such a nice job of pointing us to some important key things we can be thinking about to do differently or be considering up ahead and immediately, in our work tomorrow. While at the same time, we know from a curiosity perspective, there's so much to learn, and hopefully we can be investing in that, digging into that, and getting all the better at engaging on these issues. So thanks for giving us that kind of mix. And I want to open it up now to everyone else. There's some really great questions that I see already. So just for folks, if you would like to raise your hand, you get to jump the line. So feel free to raise your hand if you would like to come off mute and speak and ask the panelists your question. But otherwise, I will start going through the questions that I have in order. And some of these are clarifying questions too, that I think can be a bit quicker, and then others kind of go big picture and will maybe challenge our panelists in a fun way. So the first question is just a question about the programming. This is from Rose. So Rose is curious how participants were selected to participate in the program, average profile, what that process looked like. And secondly, if gender issues did arise, maybe I'm thinking in terms of tension with men who couldn't participate, et cetera. And then Rose is curious, if those challenges did arise, what mechanisms were in place to address it as needed. So over to Jamila and Vi for that. Jamila first, I think, but Vi, if you have any additions on that one.
Okay, so when it comes to selection, there were selection criteria to select households that are going to participate. However, we find out that households have interest in going into the poultry business. And just to make it clear that after the first cycle of the buy one and get one free, it was an open market because those mother units are in those locations, so they have access to those chickens. For gender issues, there were a lot more of gender issues because the program was specifically targeting women, even though we have like a 30% male within the program. So it's more of more of insignificant issues that just has to do with why are you choosing women. And when you look at the whole mother unit model, you'll find out that I think we only have 2 female that are mother units. So it's so we also need to work on that, because the men take it more in terms of business rather than the women are doing it low house. So I don't know if Vi has something to add more on it. Over.
No, I mean, no, I have nothing to add. I'll shut up now.
And then I have another question from Claire coming in, and this is about, and actually, Claire, I hope you don't mind, I'm going to build on your question just a little bit. So Claire is wondering if that increased social capital that was found in the women's groups led to greater social cohesion more at the community level as well. And then my follow-up question was there an effort to create diverse groups of women in the first place? Were those groups kind of diverse along any lines in and of themselves? And then, but yes, I'm really curious if you identified any community level effects. Thanks. And I'll go to Vi on the research side, but then others please chime in.
Yeah, I was going to say that, I mean, there's a part of the question I think which Jamila would be better placed to answer. I think from the research, I think because of the logistical constraints, we were able to look at it only from, we were able to talk to participants in one location, which was my degree, which was sort of more stable, semi-urban location. I think that we didn't go in specifically looking for, you know, what's the diversity in these groups. I think the most diversity we found at the time and that I'm aware of was sort of the host and displaced women. But that isn't really answering your question on social cohesion. I would think that, I mean, at this stage, we were only able to identify how for these women within these communities, whether they were host or displaced or even women that didn't know one another, how these relationships were built and how they sort of, you know, moved into the sort of economic exchange and so the deepening of social connections. We haven't yet been able to explore the social cohesion question. I think that would require us to diversify into different locations, which at the time was impossible, but I hope that we will be able to do that at some point. In terms of group compositions itself, Jamila, do you know for the other, like the deep field sites, what was the composition of these groups, or for the other sites?
Okay, so for the deep field side, surprisingly, we have some groups that are majorly women and mainly women group, and we also have some other groups that even the husbands are part of those groups or relatives are part of those groups. So it's a more or less like a mixed group for some of the groups, and also for other groups it's just female only groups. Yeah.
Jessie, could I just jump in with some commentary on like the global evidence review? Because I think there's important insights to glean from there that tracks with what Vi and Jamila are saying. I think the composition of groups remain large, like to be seen exactly what works best to facilitate in-group cohesion and, you know, beyond amongst the community members from which the members are drawn from. I think what we were seeing in the global evidence review is the importance of the shared identity as women. So, you know, whether or not, so as we're bringing members across ethnicity lines, the shared identity as being a woman working together to meet shared goals, I think had a unifying effect on a lot of the community members. And I think that seems to come out pretty strongly in the literature. I think what additional layer is, you know, as I know that we're talking about women's group here in particular, but, you know, often there are efforts made to create mixed gender groups for similar like livelihood intentionalities or for more VSLA market-based focuses. And I think that's where things are a little bit more shaky. So as we start bringing together members of different genders, you know, there could be dynamics that play out within these groups that may actually minimize or, you know, attenuate some of the intended effects. And the last thing that I'll mention is, you know, especially in conflict contexts where there are alignment and political dynamics at play, groups that form organically rather than, those that are formed by intervention, such as Mercy Corps stepping in and forming these groups, tend to be aligned by kin, tend to be aligned by political identities. So as we figure out, what is our role vis-a-vis, these organically formed groups and the ways in which we can facilitate and strengthen them, we need to be really careful about what landmines we may be stepping on in either, perpetuating those dynamics, creating social tension, adding fuel where we may actually not even realize, with good intentions, we may think that we're strengthening something that's locally rooted, but actually we're working to exacerbate, existing conditions that are giving rise to social tensions. So just wanted to comment there. Thanks.
Gian, that was great. And my next question I am really grateful for. It's from Danielle, and this is going to go to Jasmine and Jamila. But the question is really around, do you see opportunities for women's self-help groups to be a model for building resilience across the humanitarian development piece kind of nexus and programming? In other words, maybe what reflections might you have on how we can be supporting this model when we're trying to connect humanitarian and development assistance, and how might it actually be an interesting bridge in a way as a programming model for those kinds of contexts. So if anyone else has thoughts too, please jump in. I might go to Jasmine first, then Jamila, and then open it up.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jessie. I think that's an excellent question, and I think it is very important. I want to try to say African parable that's very common, but I probably will butcher it. But it's if you teach a man, you teach that man. But if you teach a woman, you teach the community. So essentially, because the women are the ones who raise the children, and they're the ones who teach the children. So in all of the activities that I've worked on in working with USAID, the most successful ones that I've seen have been the ones with women groups. One project I was working on, a woman, very similar to what Jamila was stating, being able to pay school fees, being able to buy a house, build a house, being able to be self-sustainable, to have a better quality of life for herself and for her children, and in addition, in connection, of course, her husband. But what I'm seeing in our programming, when we do focus on women and youth, it has a more long sustainable result that can be something that can help for generations and not just for that moment. And so I think it is a great template that we have been using, and it has been very successful, as you see with this activity with the chicken food chain, and with many of the activities that we do with USAID. Jamila, over.
Jamila, feel free to chime in, but also it looks like maybe you froze for a second, so I don't know if that's the case. I can head over to the next question, but also feel free to chime in if you're able to. Oh, perfect. Okay, so because we have a bunch of questions, so I'll keep going, but Jamila, I'd love you to chime in if you can on that, and if you have any thoughts in a minute. And some of these I think can go to a couple of folks as well. So I'm curious, this next question we have is, how has the perception of insecurity impacted project implementation in light of women and girls being targeted by Boko Haram and jihadists? And I might go to Jasmine first as well, just from a corporate USAID Nigeria perspective. I'm curious how insecurity in general might be changing how you're thinking or what you're seeing on that. But then on the programming side too, I'd be super curious what Jamila has experienced there. So yeah, Jasmine, over to you, and then to Jamila.
So from my experience, and I've definitely not excused, but I've only been here in Nigeria for about 3 months. But in my experience of working with our implementing partners that are doing activities in the Northeast, it really, Boko Haram affects the whole region, but it really affects girls and women, essentially because they are the most vulnerable. And since they're the most vulnerable, of course, they're highly targeted. And so the reason why we look to do activities with them and implement projects with them is because they are so vulnerable. They're sometimes in situations where they're the ones that need the help the most. We have one activity that is implemented through Mercy Corps that's called our Rural Resilience Activity. And that activity, we had a focus on women and youth. And in that particular activity, it was a project where it was a VSL, but it was one where it got to a point to where the women could have banking accounts, where they can have an account because it was safer for them to have bank accounts than it was for them to carry the money that they were making to wherever they had to do for the activity that they were doing. So it was an opportunity for them to be safer, because with a bank account, it just goes into the account. They have a card, they can spend money how they need or transfer money how they need, opposed to having money and being even more of a target. So there's many different activities similar to that we do to try to get around and keep the women safer, because they're definitely in harm's way. Okay.
And Jamila, do you want to hop in on that one too?
Okay, yeah, so just like Jasmine mentioned, and sorry, my network just went off a bit. So just like Jasmine mentioned with regards to women and young girls being targeted during the Boko Haram, and young guys being part of the people that are being forced to be in those soldiers. The rural resilience activity currently, as I mentioned before, through USAID, what we are doing is to kind of look at, even within the fragile context, how do we ensure, and I'm sure Jasmine mentioned it with regards to how we link farmers, link women to financial institutions. Women have now access to not just keeping their money at home, or not just even doing transactions at home, but also trying to find out innovative ways of having that access to finances, ensuring that even when they are going to the bank, there are some kind of ensuring the rigid constitutions or the rigid bylaws within financial institutions are being softened, and so that women and youths can have access to financial services, and as well be able to thrive within the same community that they are working in. I think that's just what I want to also highlight again. Thank you.
I just wanted to say what Jamila was saying is that one of our other colleagues in Nigeria was talking about these, these savings groups, and just how much money they are able to save and, capitalize among themselves. Is actually just the value of that money is making more formal financial services interested in coming and engaging with these groups. So it's kind of sort of like, yeah, they're sort of rushing to the scene. So I think Jamila, I think it's a matter of just how do we highlight the potential of these groups and the financial potential of these groups to the more sort of formal institutions, but giving people the choice of how they want to access their savings. I muted myself before. I wanted to say I'll mute myself now. There it is.
Perfect. Thanks, Vi. And I wanted to flag, I have a couple, I think, more rapid fire poultry production related questions coming up. So some folks just want to know some more details about the programming. So these will mostly go to Jamila, but others chime in if you have insight on this as well. And the first question is someone asking or sharing how poultry production is grossly affected by Newcastle disease. And they're just wondering if there have been any market-led women-friendly disease control initiatives to address that. So Jamila, over to you if you have any insights, and no worries if not.
Okay, so as PDR grows, we have women who are going into the veterinary services, trying to also work with the lead firm, which is Amo Farm, because they have a veterinarian situated in the Northeast, whom is charged with working with these women, working with mother units to ensure that they prevent those diseases. We're not saying it won't happen, but other measures of ensuring there are vaccines for chicks. There are also adequate knowledge, adequate capacity building on how to ensure chicks are vaccinated, how to even do the vaccination. All these are measures that were put in place. And then more especially in terms of relationship. So this relationship is the one thing that is key between the lead firm, the veterinary government veterinary service, and as well the farmers. So these are what we put in place. Over.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm gonna just send another question right back at you. Someone is asking, this is Rose. She was curious if women or households were willing to pay full price for the chickens once the business was established. If so, was there traction among the private sector actors to service these areas and see these communities as viable markets without external influence? So yeah, I think just some great questions about sustainability with the programming model. So yeah, Jamila, back to you. Thanks.
Okay, so with the sustainability model of the program, now remember I said when you buy one, you get one for free. So I will go a little bit deeper in terms of how this program went. So while you buy one, you get one for free, and then also there is a complimentary feed where we give you for free. So all this at the behind, it's Mercy Corps that is paying. So while you use, say for instance, in Naira, you use 10,000 to just brood this chicken to 12 weeks, you started selling it. So you use 10,000 to brood, let's say 10 or 20 chicken, and then you sell one at a price of 3,000, 3,500, and this is also within your community. So you can, if you put out the margin, it's actually something that they use the money to diversify into other businesses. And as I'm talking to you right now, some of them have ships, some of them have going to cap making, knitting, petty trading, and so on. So in terms of sustainability, they have that and as well have the capacity when it comes to training. Over.
Awesome. And I'm looking at time because we have 8 minutes until we wrap up, and 3 or 4 questions. So we'll see if we can squeeze them in, but if we can't, I'm sure we can follow up with folks after the event. The next question is, you know, in terms of men's opinions on women's working or starting their business, and I think Vi answered this, but I'll just give Vi a chance to clarify. The question is, were there any focus group discussions or key informant interviews with men specifically, or were the comments we were hearing about men coming from the participants themselves? So Vi, over to you to just clarify again on that one. Thanks.
Yeah, Sandra, I was just, I saw that question. I was just typing a response, but I'll answer that now. So I think the men's perceptions about women, so just wanted to just flag that for this research, we talked to male and female participants, majority women, but also male participants from 2 programs. On the PDR, it was primarily women because that was their target group. On the other program, which is called MIDA, and I know the program manager of that program is on this webinar. Her name is Thierry. She is not responding to my chat messages. I just wanted to say that that program had men and women. So we had the opportunity to talk to both men and women participants in that. So, you know, women's perceptions about why, women's perceptions and men's perceptions about women's role were, they were narrating it from their perspective. So women perceived that because they were contributing more towards the household, and that they had the sort of equal partnership, that, you know, the men could, their own husband could come and borrow money from them. This was the reason why the household or spousal communications improved. That was women's perceptions, right? But men's perceptions were slightly different in that they were talking about women's capabilities. So on the MIDA program, where men and women were working together, what men were saying is, now that we're seeing women working with us, we understand that it's not just about her role in the household. She's actually capable of doing a lot more. So, you know, there was even a narrative about where this male farmer said, you know, we never used to plant onions before. We started seeing our women colleagues plant onions, and now we're doing this as well. And so the shift in men's perceptions about women were reflected in both male participant as well as female participant narratives. But the way they perceived this change had come about was slightly different. So that's what I wanted to, and I hope I answered that question. It was all from we didn't do focus group discussions. We only did one-to-one, and it was all program participants from across these two programs, Sandra. So I hope I answered that. Perfect.
Vi, that's great. And I also saw that you put a great answer in the chat. So Amoti had asked what other kinds of value chains might fit this model. And Vi, I thought your answer was great. I don't know if you want to maybe read it out loud super quickly. Then, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so I think, Amoti, your question was this market systems approach, or this promotion, this buy one, get one free. And if I recall correctly, we've used this buy one, get one free, I think, on a USAID program in Ethiopia, the Prime program. And I think that one was with pastoralist farmers. I think we've also used it in Timor-Leste for a solar value chain. But I don't think it is limited to specific value chains, but I do think the learning from PDR shows that we need to have specific components in place. You do need to have a lead agent like Amo Farms who's interested in expanding to this area where you want to work. You do need to have a product which has a demand. So if you're trying to introduce something that is, you know, completely new and that doesn't have a demand, I very much doubt if people are going to actually participate in the program. And I think third, and somewhat more importantly, Amoti, is that you will have to work hard towards changing people's mindset in terms of investing in this livelihood, right? So this is a new, because they're used to NGOs coming and giving them things for free. So why should you buy, or why should you invest your own money? And I think I just want to say what was really interesting when we were talking to some of the women on the PDR program, they mentioned that some of the other women in their community didn't take this opportunity because they were a bit suspicious. They were like, well, you know, this is not really an NGO approach. Why do you want us to invest our own money? But they later realized that this was an opportunity that they had missed because they were seeing how well these women were doing. But it does take some time to actually change people's mindset. And I think the fault also comes back to us, right? So as humanitarian actors, if we're all doing handouts and then you suddenly have this one organization that wants to come in and change things, it's not going to work. You all need to coordinate with one another. So I do think, long story short, there isn't a specific value chain. I think if you have some of these principles in mind, I think you could do it. You could do it in any context. Pause.
Awesome, Vi, thank you. I'm going to read our last question as a comment just for the room. Wendy shares, I love Jasmine's use of the proverb about teaching a man, teaching a woman. I can't help but note also that this whole panel is made of women. Is there anything worth taking away from that? So I don't think we need to comment on it, but just a nice comment from Wendy. And with that, I am going to thank our panelists and everyone for their incredible questions. I really enjoyed this. This was, to me, a very fun way to spend my Thursday morning, afternoon for some other folks. And I also wanted to flag, first, we will be putting an evaluation in the chat, so please fill that out. This event is unfortunately the last of the scheduled rapid learning series briefs and events that we have, but there's absolutely more on the way, so please stay tuned for emails on what's next, and thank you for joining the series if you've been with us for the past few sessions. And otherwise, I am just very grateful to our presenters, to our panelists. I thought this was extremely insightful, extremely interesting. I hope everyone has some ideas kind of kicking around in their minds, as well as some practical ideas to take into tomorrow. So with that, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.